Increasingly growing in economic power, China has become recurrent in French media. Issues regarding the Chinese economics not only affect the Chinese people, but also French immigrants.
Pourquoi ils sont venus? Comment ils se sont intégrés?
According to sinologist Pierre Picard, the mysterious Chinese community in Europe resembles an iceberg where only one facet seems known. France is the country that receives the most Chinese immigrants in Europe, totally over 600,000 people. Compared to other immigrant communities, the Chinese community is relatively discreet. Arriving in the 1970s from poverty-stricken Southeast China, the immigrants tried to obtain higher status in French society. They work hard, concentrating completely on their businesses. The Chinese lower status and indifference towards political and social issues caused them to be labeled as the community with total silence.
C'est lorsque les boat people sont arrivés dans les années
They live very quietly. When these boat people came to France in 1970s, the majority of immigrants came from the southeast of China.
de la Chine, ils étaient très dynamiques et plus que ceux
They are very active in commercial business. People originally from Zhejiang dwell near Republic. They opened shops with their partners and created this Chinatown which did not exist before.
Attirés par les infrastructures et les usines toutes proches,
Today, we find various stories concerning China in French media.
On en sait plus.
The triumph of Chinese managers in French companies and illegal Chinese immigrants have become popular topics for French journalists in news coverage. Spring Festival in Chinatown.
pousser les esprits malins et d'attirer au passage.
Investigation upon standards of hygiene in Chinese restaurant.
Nous choisissons 10 traiteurs.
Une manifestation aujourd'hui dans le quartier
Security protest in Chinatown.
de la rue pour protester contre l'insécurité. Depuis plusieurs mois, la communauté chinoise se dit victime
French newspaper and magazine present more and more subjects about China. Vincent Mougaillard, a French journalist from newspaper Le Parisien in Paris, conducted a survey in the Chinese community. His interest is related to illegal immigrants who collected rejected materials to sell.
Aujourd'hui, que ce sont les nouveaux chiffonniers ou ces
They are 21st century charity men. They are collectors. By selling these little things they collected from garbage, they earn nearly 100 euros. Some of them earn 400 or 500 euros per month. Some of them send the money back to their relatives in China. Even though they live in this way, we know it is difficult for them to live with dignity.
Ils peuvent vivre, mais effectivement, c'est très dur pour leur dignité.
After his investigation with this group of immigrants, this French reporter may have better vision about illegal immigrants in Paris. It was not the first time that French journalists engaged in such issues, associating with terms like slavery land or undermined work. Illegal immigrants, prostitution, medical system scandals, and industrial espionage seem to be subjects that interest the French public. Because of this, the Chinese seem to be negatively portrayed in French media.
Moi, j'ai une explication. Il se trouve que
Well, I have an explication. The Chinese community in France is very quiet. Therefore, there is no communication between us. Chinese immigrants here have few connection with the French press. For example, when Spring Festival comes, French press seldom receive the invitation from the Chinese community. Or when a child has a high score in school, his parents would not call us to say, "Here is a good example of Chinese children's academic performance in French school extra." Lack of communication from the Chinese community make it hard to improve the image of Chinese community. So in our editor meeting, without positive aspect of this community, we end up talking about negative aspects.
on a tendance à voir que ce qui est négatif.
Has this influenced the Chinese community? Olivier Wang is Chinese member from second generation of Chinese immigrants in France. His parents came to France in 1970s. Like the majority of the Chinese immigrants, they worked hard and talked little. Olivier, however, was born and educated in Paris. His parents' death played little role in his life. When he searches for the information, he surfs on internet and occasionally watches TV news.
I'm French, originally from China. When I saw the headline of Le Parisien, How Chinese Spy Works, or from L'Express, I saw the cover with How Chinese Conquer Europe. I do not feel that these are accurate description of the Chinese, because these stories are always told with a negative tone.
A French radio program, France Inter, invited Olivier to speak on the behalf of the Chinese. When he was on air, he expressed his opinion about the topic Image of Chinese People in France. Confronted with the misunderstandings on immigrants' identity, Olivier holds the view that people should not be confined to certain clichés and prejudice.
We are trying to express ourselves, telling them, listen, I do not eat dogs or cats. I'm not an illegal immigrant. I speak French well. I have a job. I work as an engineer, in post, etc. We are the same people. We will need to talk a little more with French media. For example, we will say, come to the Chinese community and find out more about our lives and culture. We are not the people described in the story pitched by the French media.
Tente désespérément de protéger sa flamme, laissée à son sort.
When the torch traveled to Paris in 2008, pro-Tibet protesters filled the streets, complicating the relay. Faced with hostility of the Chinese government and Chinese people, various television debates were launched for further discussions regarding the issues of Tibet. The French media invited experts in the field of international relations, government officers.
L'intégrité territoriale.
Chaque fois qu'il y a eu des jeux, on a protesté contre le régime du pays.
Parce qu'on peut dire quand même qu'en Chine, les droits...
French politicians.
Clairement, ils n'en ont pas la même vision que nous.
Le passage de la flamme et de toutes ces perturbations.
Bon, au lieu de dire choqué, je crois que pour moi, personnellement, le sentiment, c'est plutôt triste.
And the Chinese correspondence to Paris.
Parce que vous savez, à l'origine, quand on allume la torche olympique,
the event in French media, according to China Today, was particularly subjective and aggressive. Le Figaro, a French daily newspaper, indicated that the front to Olympic spirit was only the case of the minority of the Tibetan exiles, amplified by biased Western media. CCTV, the Central National Television of the country, avoided violent pictures by using the archives of the French monuments in daily news.
J'aime beaucoup la photo. Vous voyez, par exemple, j'aime bien cette photo, c'est chez les Dong, chez la minorité.
Philippe Rochaud, a reporter of television France 2, has lived in Beijing as a correspondent for 6 years. Highly sensible to topics concerning China, he also witnessed the demonstration and conflicts in the torch relay 2006.
La flamme olympique, c'était une occasion pour toutes les associations de défense des droits.
The torch relay was the occasion for associations of human rights, independence of Tibet or others, to publicly manifest their requests. So at the moment, all streets were crowded with people.
Qui étaient venus de toute l'Europe pour essayer de faire valoir.
Even some associations from other European countries came to protest this occasion, knowing that it was a good time to protest. All the cameras were on standby, and the reporters were all prepared.
Sur le défilé de la flamme olympique, et donc les associations venaient se greffer là, quoi.
His experience in China enabled him to view things more objectively and without bias. When he talked about the stories pitched by his French peers to describe China and Chinese people, he suggested that they misunderstood the country sometimes due to prejudice and established stereotypes.
Tiens, ça c'est chez Miao, ça.
Les clichés sur la Chine continuent à persister.
For example, when we talk about one-child policy in China, the majority of French hold the view that every Chinese family has only one child.
C'est un pays de 1,3 milliard d'habitants, donc c'est quelque chose d'énorme, c'est quelque chose pour nous de démesuré. Par exemple, l'enfant unique.
Exceptions, however, do exist at its coverage on families with more than one child. In China, a national minority is approved to have more than one child. Sometimes illegal children do exist. You can choose to pay a fine for having more than one child. One-child policy is actually not an absolute policy in China.
2 enfants, voire même 3 enfants.
The other possible explication for the misunderstandings is that it's not always easy to obtain the source. Anna Soymont, young French reporter, has interest in China and its culture. She works for RFI, French International Radio, and the Division Monde. She also worked 1 year for RCI, Chinese International Radio, and recorded her journalistic experience with her own book, I Work for Chinese Propaganda. In China, sometimes it's difficult to obtain a solid source. Suppose that you do an investigation about the latest percentage of purchasing power. You contact a certain institution, such as National Institution of Consummation, and officers will give you some numbers. But it was the national institution that diffused these numbers. The institution depends upon the governments. In other words, these numbers are controlled, manipulated by the government. It was not the fault of the powerful groups. Once published, these numbers can't be confirmed. It is difficult to work as business reporter in China. It is difficult to pitch the story about Tibet. On one hand, you hear certain radical statements about life in Tibet. On the other hand, the government shows an opposite attitude. It's complicated. Plus, it's not easy to enter the area. For foreign reporters, we need certain permissions for field reporting. Once we are in Tibet, people everywhere follow us. Because we have difficulties in finding sources and accumulating information, the French media convey some information without fact-checking. It is difficult for both French and Chinese journalists to know what is really happening in this country. Exposure to internet, blog, and social media leads to information overload nowadays. The Chinese public opinion is increasingly influenced by Western media. The openness nowadays has 2 significances. Despite the language barrier, French people could learn more about China by various means. Exchanges of opinions and increased public discussions can help establish a more objective and unbiased view. Therefore, people are more intended to have a real understanding about each other. To sum up, a real democracy could be an impetus of media progress.